Welcome to the 13th International Congress for Analytical Psychology, held August 20th through the 25th, 1995 in Zurich, Switzerland. This is tape number GS6. The title of the presentation is The Bipolar Split in Analytical Psychology. This session was recorded live and unedited. Thank you.
Yesterday, this is just a remark before I start for the translators. Yesterday, Andrew Samuels talked about the fact that we hadn't yet mourned Jung. And I thought that was right, that we were still in an active process of mourning him. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah. And I thought, well, that's really what I'm doing today in a very peculiar way. But still, I think that's it. In this paper, I propose to discuss the present situation, causes, and possible fate of the split in analytical psychology between the so-called symbolic and clinical factions. Although not rigidly defined, these groups center about the use and amplification of unconscious symbolism on one hand, and the use of regression and interpretation mainly on the other. They are not mutually exclusive, of course. They might even be complementary. But human nature being what it is, we have made them oppositional. Andrew Samuels has reviewed the history of this split and described it in terms of an archetypal orientation on one hand, a developmental one on the other, and a classical area somewhere in between. My discussion will not be from the viewpoint of an objective observer, but really from the personal experience of one who has lived through it and has been right in the middle of it. The story, or my part of it really, begins with my brief time as a student at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich in 1959. At that time, it was still situated in the Gemeindestrasse. I was in the last year of my psychiatric residency, and I was on a very slim stipend, which I stretched as far as I could, which in that case was to Zurich. The golden years of the club, when Jung, Emma, and Tony Wolff were teaching, were over at that time. Jung was ill and came only rarely to the Institute, or while I was there, I saw him not at all. Emma and Tony were dead, but the most brilliant students and collaborators with Jung were in their heyday, and students from all over the world came to hear them. Yolanda Jacobi was the most extroverted of the group, and she actually spoke personally with some of the students. It was generally assumed that since you had come to the Jung Institute, you would want a classical Jungian analysis. But if you wanted the other kind, and you could get that, quote, down the road. But Dr. Jacobi, however, announced at one of the first meetings that she could do either a Jungian or a Freudian analysis. Being somewhat flamboyant, she stood out from the others like a sore thumb. But she was a natural teacher and a great extrovert, not too deep, but very passionate. It was that if it hadn't been for her enthusiastic reaching out, we as green newcomers would have been gone entirely unnoticed. Barbara Hanna was there too, in full bloom. She was at that time giving a thorough course on the Brontes. She spoke about them effortlessly, without notes, as if she knew them personally, or as if they lived next door. And she knew all the details of their private life, although she was partial to Bromell. It was one of those situations in which you might find yourself knowing more about the Brontes than you really ever wanted to know. Miss Hannah was the school marm, one of the best, though. She was aware of the depths behind the facade, and she was unstintingly honest and straightforward in her talk. In her biography, she was one of the few early ones who confronted Jung about the relationship with Tony Wolff, and she spoke about it freely. During my stay in Zurich at that time, 1959, in spite of our coffeehouse gossip of almost every afternoon about everybody and everything, the relationship between Tony Wolff and Jung never came up. It was not mentioned in any way. There was a slight, there was a tight lid on it, and I found out about it only much later. In the case of a great man, unfortunately, perhaps unfortunately, in the end, not much remains hidden. Posterity is patient, but relentless. The undisputed star was von Franz. Her instantly available erudition and profound insight into Jung's concepts was amazing. I think she was the most erudite and immediately erudite person I've ever met. And those lectures were the most profound. But then I never heard Jung. I guess he went a little further. I remember someone remarking that she was more Jungian than Jung himself. Perhaps that meant, as I see it now, that she was more organized, more coherent, and intellectually clear, and she had the advantage of not being the first one. What she and the other speakers presented was a humanism that was free and all-embracing, but still moored in psychology. She was Kantian in the largest meaning of that philosophy. Mythology, theology, literature, history, and language were presented not only for the wonders of their own discipline, but also as products of the psyche in its larger function. Their motto might have been, the study of psychology is the study of everything, even the works of the Brontes, as products of the psychological mind. You can imagine what effect that had on an impressionable young man raised in mid-Illinois. It was a revelation, nothing less. I, in fact, started to read all of Jung that was then available in English in what you might call one sitting, with short breaks for the toilet, for eating, and for sleeping. But that brings us squarely back to the theme of this paper. Such a wonderful outpouring as it was of creativity always has a hidden but considerable shadow. And I was not the only one to fall squarely into it. That shadow could be characterized under two headings: inflation and neglect of the transference. But they are closely connected. Many of us in those days were caught up in the grandeur of Jung's psychology. One could first analyze the shadow, which maybe would take a year, maybe not that long. And then with the help of deep dreams, one could take on the anima and the animus, and that might take a little while longer, and then one could tackle the self. Actually, we really thought this. That is not too much of a caricature. That is the way, at least this was the way I was thinking, and I think other people I talked to were thinking that way also. But even then, for that Midwestern background, I think, gave me some inkling that individuation was not won quite so cheaply. It took Jung a lifetime, after all. It would take us no less. I wonder if Jung knew how truly he spoke when he said that he would rather be Jung than a Jungian. You know, that has two sides. We were left with the fruits of his genius and a powerful model on which to build, but we also inherited his shadow. And so, as well as our own. And so we are full of doubts and contradictions. We must find our own ways, shoulder our own burdens, not Jung's. And that, in the nature of things, is how it should be. Children should leave home. Then there is the second element of the shadow of those early times, which is the neglect of the transference. Even though in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung admitted to Freud that transference was the alpha and omega of analytic therapy, neither of them took their shrewd insights to heart. It was the custom in those days, as it has been reported to be 20 years earlier, to go easily from one analyst to another. The earlier days, for example, one could see Tony Wolff for 6 months and then be sent to see Jung for another period of time, and then he would send you to see Emma. If you were seeing a woman, perhaps you needed to see a man. Or if you needed to have someone who was especially versed in Egyptian or Greek symbolism, then you would go to see that person. They simply did not see the transference as we see it now. For Freud, as well as for Jung in those early days, the transference was really an obstacle in the way to dealing with the more important things, perhaps dealing with it by interpretation or dream analysis. That is quite a different thing than the way we look at it now. I think most of us, however great our other differences might be, would see the transference as the centerpiece of analytic therapy, the mainspring dynamism by which the therapeutic process unfolds. Jung understood that theoretically in the psychology of the transference, but did not too well put it into practice. Behind this confusion about the transference, there was a more hidden disparity. We were dealing with two very different kinds of analysis. The first one, which included spiritual growth as part of individuation, which, as it turned out, spanned a lifetime, and that which was directed, and the other, which was directed toward emotional injuries of childhood and infancy that extended into the present as complexes. And that kind of analysis involved use of regression and was expected to do its work within a limited number of years. We never got these two kinds of analysis thoroughly straightened out. And we were often trying to do two of them or both of them at the same time, even though their methods, guidelines, and goals were quite different. I think it's still that way. The first kind of analytic therapy, the kind that was practiced by Jung himself and by most of the early members of the Zurich Institute, except Yolanda, can be called dream or vision-centered. Dreams and visions were the main focus of that action. They were analyzed and elucidated through association, amplification, active imagination, and serial integration, or analyzing a series of dreams in one continuum. Much work in writing, studying, visualizing, and drawing dreams could be done by the patient outside the outside the analytic hour, so meetings could be less frequent. The patient and analyst usually sat vis-a-vis, and the work of dealing with regression and the transference was done mostly through the dream work. The dream itself was the temenos for this mode of therapy, and its great value is that it reaches for the deepest layers of psyche and the deepest images that come from the psyche. Using intuition as its major function, it orients itself to the patient's entire process of individuation over a lifetime. For that reason, it can accommodate itself to frequent changes of analysts, shorter periods of time, shorter periods of work spread out over a longer time, with the expectation that the patient will do much of the work outside the analytic process. This kind of analytic work, I think, is particularly useful in midlife, in the case of serious illness or old age, or in the face of oncoming death. It is essential, I think, for a person with a strong spiritual leaning, though it need not be the only analytic work for such a person. According to Jung's idea of individuation, this kind of analytic work tends to create a symbolic system of life values rooted in sacredness and offering access to a spiritual path. The religions of the North American Indians, which I am familiar with somewhat, have much in common with this view, relying on the vision quest and big dreams to guide the seeker over a lifetime. There are weaknesses in this kind of work. I have already mentioned some. Not everyone can remember dreams or connect them to everyday life, or even want to. Very strong repressed feelings may be indicated in dreams, but not experienced. Also, this work is easier for intuitives who, unfortunately for us, do not represent the entire population. In the Zurich of the 60s, we were thoroughly imbued with this dream-centered analytic work. And we went home to the United States, or those of us from the United States, and other countries, expecting to put it into full practice. I returned to complete my training at the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. I actually didn't have enough money to stay in Zurich. Because you couldn't really work and make money. So I went back to San Francisco. The Jung group there was minuscule at that time compared with the overwhelming presence of the Freudians. When I told my supervisor in my residency of my intention to take up Jungian analysis, he looked at me as though I were one of the walking dead. It was over for me. I went into analysis then with Joe Wheelwright. It was certainly not a classical Jungian analysis. It did not center especially on dreams, although dreams were part of it. But it was relationship-oriented, a second mode of analytic work. The dreams and visions were the first one, relying more on the feeling function. We sat face to face. There was some regression and a good deal of dream work, but the relationship was central and authentic. He did not imitate Jung or anybody else. He was completely, for better or worse, himself. And for that, I'm still grateful. It was a father-son love affair. And by that, I mean a close, gutsy, instinctual experience, which was also sacred. Those are the two poles. And I think they can be united only through the intimate relationship with another person. I think Jung understood that in the psychology of the transference, but whether he actually practiced it or not is another question. Such relation-centered therapy also has its shortcomings. There may be too much looseness of the container. Really intense feelings of rage, hatred, envy, or greed may not be well contained in such a therapy. There is the possibility of avoidance of deeply unconscious material or arousing sudden transference reactions which will not resolve. I'm not just speaking theoretically. I can think of many examples for all of those. And such cases are not rare. But when the connection is good and the regressed material not too primal, this therapeutic work can be very real, very powerful, and very effective. But this was also the 60s in San Francisco, and the great wave of the hippie era was upon us. Some saw it as enlightened humanism. Others saw it as irresponsible hooliganism. At any rate, in such works as Bob Dylan's Tambourine Man and All Along the Watchtower, the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, and the Doors' Break On Through to the Other Side, it did seem that popular culture was touching on the deep psyche, Some called it the crack in the cosmic egg. I remember coming home one evening and waiting at the point where Haight Street meets the Golden Gate Park as a long parade of Krishna devotees made their way with a full-sized juggernaut in their midst. But Jung, with his archetypal symbolism, his interest in myth and fairy tales, and his concept of individuation, was part of it all. My office was full of people talking about psychedelic experiences, communal styles of living, sexual freedom, and return to the land. Interest in Jungian psychology grew enormously, and we had sell-out weekend conferences frequently. Those were the days. I thought, my friend, I thought they'd never end. But they did. It all came for me to the highest point at the birthday celebration for Jung's 100th birthday, which was hosted by the University of California at the Miyake Hotel in 1975. It was packed to the rafters with people wildly enthusiastic about Jung. There was even a huge birthday cake with 100 candles. It was a celebration of archetypal dimensions. Somebody gave me a pin just before I came here tonight, which says an archetype is an archetype is an archetype is an archetype. And that was an archetypal cake. And it was, to my memory, the last of those great conferences. After 1975, slowly at first, a great change came over the Jungian world. Where before everything had been reasonably cohesive, now there was a discernible split. I first became aware of that at the IAAP Congress in Jerusalem in the early 80s. I heard one young woman, probably a candidate, say to another that she never wanted to hear the word symbol again in her life. I thought she must have come to the wrong place. But I was wrong. She was not alone in her sentiment. The split between the so-called symbolic side of Jungian psychology, which I have referred to as dream-centered, and the so-called clinical side, which is represented by relationship and by regression-centered models, had begun in earnest. The flaws in Jung's psychology were very vividly brought to the fore. Failure to recognize the power and destructive potential of the transference. Failure to give due recognition to the need for developmental regression. And serious boundary problems, leading to ethical violations, including many sexual relationships with patients. There was a growing realization that despite the enthusiastic claims, Jungian therapy in its classical form could not cover the whole needs of a psychotherapeutic practice, even a highly specialized analytical one. Classical Jungian analysis produced some great successes, especially in people who were hungry for a deeper inner spiritual life, who could find it nowhere else, and who were mature enough to contain and reduce the inflation that invariably accompanies as a necessary component of such experiences. But at times, this kind of analytic work could not meet the demands of regressive complexes. Awakened by the transference and flooding into the psyche from earlier, sometimes infantile times, such cases may need another different model of therapy, which I have referred to already as regression-centered. This model is, of course, based historically on Freudian psychoanalysis, but has been greatly modified by innovators such as Melanie Klein, Kohut, Langs, Winnicott, Fairbairn, Guntripp, and most notably by Michael Fordham, who recently, as you know, died, whose efforts, I think, to bring Freudian and Jungian concepts together have been greatly undervalued by both sides. The original idea in regressive-centered work, which had been greatly modified since the early days, was that the analyst was expected to remain objective. He relied on the patient to produce free association. No personal reactions or even polite amenities were permitted. That is a far cry from the days when Toni Wolff would have tea with her patients. It's a totally different way of looking at things. He relied on the patient to produce free associations. No personal reactions or even polite amenities were permitted. The container was to be very tight. In order to further facilitate regression, the patient was to come many times a week, perhaps 4 or 5, and to lie on the couch, which put him or her into a vulnerable, childlike position in relation to the analyst. The analyst's traditional response to this regression was interpretation, largely, but not entirely, based on thinking. Thinking along rational and lucid lines yields a very useful picture of one's childhood and its subversion. It even makes sense of the confusing welter of feelings going on in the transference at that very moment. It can be validating and liberating, especially in regard to the personal unconscious as it is affected by infancy and childhood. This form of therapy can contain very intense feeling and can be reparative in a most satisfying way. Someone, I think it was Frida Fordham, has compared it to slowly knitting up a torn garment, or in this case, a torn life. Its shortcomings are that it is expensive and time-consuming, and the relatively objective nature of the analyst may be felt as cold or even hostile. It does not usually touch the archetypal layers consciously of the deep psyche, although sometimes that might happen. And it sometimes evokes the most intense regressive feelings of need and dependency, which can be very difficult to resolve. By the late 80s, at the time of the Paris conference, there were not only growing insights into the limitations of Jung's psychology, there was a growing awareness that as a person, Jung was not the ideal we had allowed ourselves to imagine. Hans Dichmann gave a particularly good metaphor. He said, "It's never so dark than at the base of a lighthouse." Jung, it was realized, had a considerable shadow. The accusations about his anti-Semitism had always been around, but now, as direct quotations were assembled and investigations made, there seemed to be a good deal of truth in them. I will not rehearse all of that. You've all heard it before. But there is one part that's difficult to pass over. At the Paris conference, there was a report by Arye Maidenbaum and Stephen Martin that even after the Hitler era, there was a quota system for Jews in force at the Analytical Psychology Club in Zurich that lasted until 1950. There was also deep criticism of Jung's relationship with some of his women patients that showed a disregard for the transference and the boundaries it imposes. Michael Fordham stated in his autobiography that he was very angry with Jung for talking one way about the transference and acting another. There were also critics who felt that Jung liked and acquired power much more than he admitted. There were a good many instances in which his influences over his followers, admirers, and patients seemed to go too far. As we would look at it now, there were a great many dual relationships, if not triple and quaternal, in Zurich. Almost everyone who knew him admits that Jung had a poor feeling function, and one woman analyst who saw him in the 30s described him as monstrously insensitive. Still filled with gratitude for the great mentor who gave so generously of his gifts. to all of us, and who I believed saved my own young life at a crucial point. And perhaps it is a mark of maturity in our group to be able to live with that ambivalence. If one can learn to live with the loss of one's ideals, with the shadow of one's transference experience with one's analyst, then perhaps one can even learn to live with one's own shadow. And then one can see one's own considerable faults reflected from the eyes of one's colleagues, one's students, one's patients, and one's children. That's growing up. So we stand here in the middle of the 90s in some disarray. We have found many inadequacies in our psychology. We have discovered many imperfections in our founder. There are quarrels in our societies, some having split into 2 or more groups, even recently. Our goals and our future are cloudy and divisive. Where do we go from here? Anybody have? Thank you. By way of pointing to a deeper level of this problem, I'm going to tell you a Native American trickster story, appropriately enough entitled, Why Raven Isn't Perfect. Raven, you know, is a cultural trickster figure from the Northwest Coast. He is also a creator and a hero, all at the same time. And along with Coyote, he has much to teach us, and here is part of it. To begin the story, there were 2 ravens, both snow white, and they were busy creating all the creatures of the world. Perhaps they were like Freud and Jung, you know, creating all these new kinds of therapy. But whenever one of them, the good raven, would create a beautiful creature, the other would, in a nasty, critical way, destroy it. For instance, when the good raven made a beautiful fish with perfect balance and symmetry and rainbow-hued scales, and was standing back to admire it, suddenly the other raven rushed out of the nearby wood, raised his huge foot, and stomped on it. Then the good raven's heart tensed with hate, for there, instead of the beautiful fish, a flat flounder flopped about his feet. If you keep doing that, said the good raven, who wasn't so good anymore, I'll kill you. But the bad raven persisted, and so with some subtle trickery and not so subtle sharp acts, the good raven, which was which now, killed the bad one. As the good raven stared down at his dead twin, he moaned, "What have I done?" He tried to wipe the blood from his feathers, but it could not be removed, and it spread over him and grew darker until his once white feathers were as black as the winter's night. "It is happening in my heart, too," he said. "It is darkening, as if my brother's spirit had moved in beside my own. What will happen now? Will I ever make a perfect creature? Will we ever make the perfect therapy?" He began to make creatures again, but they all had serious flaws. The deer was fleet and graceful, but he was a coward. The bear was large and strong, but he was greedy. Finally, he made humans, but there was always something wrong with them, too. He noticed that those who were sensitive and kind were also weak and ineffective, and those who were strong and confident were neither kind nor tolerant. The black raven almost despaired, but finally he said, In all these creatures I have made something perfect as I aspire to be. But in these same creatures there are great flaws and evil intentions, as my brother would have wished. Just once more, I will try to make a perfect being. But inside me, I will have to hold my brother's bad spirit away from my own, but not too far away. Carefully, Raven made soft, long hair the color of autumn. Next he fashioned the body, shaping it to fit perfectly in its world, not too large and not too small. Then slowly he breathed upon it. Then he stood back and watched life fill its lungs. While the other creatures, especially the devious fox, saw this perfect creature, they were mad with hate and envy. Raven saw that as soon as he put the creature down, they would destroy it. "Stand back," he said, and he rolled the still wet creature over the sharp pine needles on the ground. Then he let it go, and when Fox rushed up to strike it, his paws were pierced with the needles, and they stuck in him as he ran away howling. Raven saw this, and from deep within him, somewhere near where the spirit of his bad brother sat beside his own good spirit, a new sensation came rushing into his throat, and then Raven laughed, and it was the first laugh in all the world. The moral here is not only that a sense of humor might save us from quarreling to our own destruction. This story is about warring opposites and integrating the shadow. As I have given it some thought, it seems to me that the porcupine is not such a bad symbol for individuation. He is humble, unassuming. He goes about his vegetarian way with no heroic attributes, and he is well protected. One might do worse. Since for the moment we cannot solve all the important questions that beset us, on both sides of our current polarity, as always, we fear that in compromising we will lose our greatest treasure. So we must gather what skills and integrity we possess, practice the therapy that seems right for each of us, recognizing that people really are different in their perceptions, in their functioning, in their thinking and feeling, and every other way. What one man can do, another can't. And what one cherishes as the best, as the very best, is of indifference or scorn to the other. So to keep to our way, we must be open and aware, and yet protected with a hide full of sharp needles. Our way of coming together will become clear, but for now it is a slow process, reminding me of the old joke question, how do porcupines make love? And the answer, which for us also is very carefully. That was told to me by a nun who also said that that's the way nuns make love, as well as porcupines. There are many people now becoming aware that we might destroy the unique core of Jungian psychology in our zeal for the perfect kind of analysis. Is it possible to do full justice to regressive and symbolic-centered therapy in one analysis or by one analyst? Is it possible to offer a full-range analytic practice under the name of Jung alone or by oneself alone? Probably not. But in spite of our differences, we have something very powerful in common: the strength and transformational ability of the transference. The training and ability to use that power consciously, which we have learned slowly and painfully with many mistakes, puts us as long-term therapists apart from all other kind of psychotherapy. It is a treasure that Freud and Jung have bequeathed us. And like the porcupine, it needs protection. The transference-countertransference interaction, to me, is the nuclear energy of analytic psychology. And we must learn to handle it carefully. And I'm going to insert 2 sentences here now for the translators. I'll do it slowly. I think that transference experience lived in our own analysis determines our truth. There is little scientific or abstract theory that we know to be true. It is our own lived experience, and we must respect its truth in ourselves. And if we can do that, then we can respect it in others. I have come to believe that every practicing analyst should have at least 1 hour of supervision a month with anyone of his or her choice. I also think this should be continued from the beginning to the end of one's professional career, no matter how long it is. Long-term therapy, consciously using the transference-countertransference, is a discipline of its own, and it should be responsible to itself. It isn't and never will be standard medical practice, not in the foreseeable future. And since events, especially in the United States, have forced our hand, we will see if long-term analytic practice can exist without the help of insurance companies, government subsidies, or outside financial support. In other words, is it worthwhile to the analysand, as it was in the beginning? My guess is that it is. My analysis, which was, as I've said, one of the turning points of my life, was paid for without any insurance, and no doubt many of you could say the same. I think that the overall experience of analysis continues to be of crucial importance to many people, and they will continue to make whatever sacrifices must be made to obtain it. No other experience offers such a deep insight into the nature of one's humanity. Not only its wonderful accomplishments, but also its cruelty and destructiveness. As Jung famously said, one does not become enlightened by imaging figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is the core work of analysis, and it can only be done within the mighty dynamism of the transference-countertransference. Making conscious the terrible shadow of human life has been one of the great works of the 20th century, and it has barely begun. Freud revealed the shadow of sexuality in sadism and masochism. Winnicott, Fairbairn, Guntrip, and others have emphasized the importance of hatred and destructiveness in the human psyche. And finally, Jung, as far as he was able, brought into consciousness the shadow of God. And these discoveries form our main guide into the next millennium. Socrates' ancient dictum, "Know thyself," is still the main hope for our survival. And we have just begun considering World Wars I and II, the Holocaust, the possibility of nuclear war, exploding overpopulation, and environmental destruction, to know what that means. Can we bear to know? In this last part, I'm going to add a few sentences for the translators. Now, again, I'll do it slowly. F. Scott Fitzgerald once said that the mark of a first-rate mind is the ability to hold 2 opposing ideas at the same time and still function. If we could do that consciously, recognizing the bipolarity that I mentioned in this paper as a fundamental function of the psyche, embedded in the transference, a precondition or goad to creativity, and not the work of an enemy. It is the spirit of our dark brother who sits always next to our heart. If we as individuals and as a group can do that, as we should be able to, then we should be able to hang together. But if we can't, then we most assuredly will hang separately. No one of us, or any one part of us, can know the whole, or even a part of the whole of the psyche. That work needs us all. Thank you.